Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons. I'm your host, Kerry Parker, and today we have episode 460 for December 22nd, 2025. So, first of all, happy holidays, everyone. I hope everyone is enjoying some joyful time with their family and friends and staying safe out there. I am planning on doing the same thing, and I'm very much looking forward to spending the holidays with my family. So, I've been doing this podcast for almost 9 years now, and I've interviewed over 200 different people. And I doubt many of you have been with me all that time, so when my December break rolls around, I like to dig back into the vaults and pull out a golden oldie interview from the early days. And there's a good chance that you've never heard this, unless you've been listening a really long time. And even so, it's been, these are old enough that you probably have forgotten this. So I went back and digging through the vaults, and I found my very first interview with Troy Hunt, who is the Australian owner and operator of a wonderful security website tool called Have I Been Pwned. He created that almost exactly 12 years ago now, if Wikipedia is to be believed. And I interviewed him in February of 2019, episode 102, and almost 7 years ago now. And I went back and re-listened to it just to make sure, it still held up, and it absolutely did. Which in some ways is frankly sad, because it means we're still dealing with the same issues all this time later. Passkeys haven't saved us yet, and we're still having data breaches left and right, which is ridiculous. So anyway, we're going to talk about data breaches. We're going to talk about passwords, and of course, we'll talk about his Have I Been Pwned tool. Troy has some excellent insights on how breaches are often covered or miscovered by the media, lots of good real-world guidelines on choosing a good password, and how to defend our accounts. We'll talk about that and all sorts of other great stuff today that, again, still holds up. It's all still great information and advice. And by the way, I will say that his tips on creating good passwords were just validated by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, who finally updated their guidelines around account security and password creation to be, frankly, more in line with exactly what Troy is going to tell you here. And I'll actually go through some of those changes after the episode. But for now, let's get to our classic replay interview episode with Troy Hunt, episode 102 from February of 2019. All right, Troy Hunt is a Microsoft Regional Director and a Most Valuable Professional Awardee for Developer Security. He's a blogger, international speaker, and author of several online courses, and the person who runs Have I Been Pwned. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And we just talked about Have I Been Pwned recently, and actually I've mentioned it on the show several times, so I'm really glad to have you on the show to explain what this is all about and how people can best use your service. And I've got plenty of other questions. So let's start with the main one. Tell us about your website. Have I Been Pwned? How did that come to be? And then, of course, probably for this audience's sake, what is pwned?
Yeah, hey, let's start with the last bit first because that's the fun one. So pwned is sort of a little bit of a colloquialism, which is a misspelling of owned. And look, I guess it's been used a lot in things like video games where someone frags the other person and haha, I owned you sort of thing. So it tends to be used a little bit when some kind of misfortune befalls a victim. And a bit of misfortune that unfortunately befalls many of us these days is we end up in a data breach. So Have I Been Pwned is a publicly searchable list of data breaches. And if you've appeared in one of these data breaches, you can go to Have I Been Pwned, plug in your email address, and it says, hey, let's say like me, you have been in the Dropbox data breach and the LinkedIn data breach. And it helps people understand where they've been exposed on the internet.
And how did you come to make this site? Like, I know that you obviously you said you were affected yourself. Maybe that's what drove you to do this. But what brought you to create this site?
Well, the catalyst for it was in late 2013. I think it was about October 2013. Adobe had a data breach. And I was in the Adobe data breach. Actually, I was in there twice. My personal email address and my work email address. And that was a pretty large incident. And there were a bunch of other incidents around the time that were a lot smaller. And I think from memory, Adobe was something like 150 million records, and there are a few others that were sort of around 1 million or something. And I'd been doing a bunch of analysis on breaches to try and learn a bit more about people's behaviors when it comes to things like how they create accounts. So, for example, turns out a lot of people use the same password everywhere. And we can demonstrate this emphatically when we have the data from multiple different systems and the same person appears in each one. Adobe was interesting too because they actually encrypted passwords, but then they had password hints, which weren't encrypted. So you'd look at the password hint and it's like my dog's name. Well, there's not a whole lot of options there, in the realm of different possibilities. And by the way, I can go to your Facebook and figure out your dog's name really quickly anyway.
Yes.
So it was really interesting to sort of see this data out there. And the sort of, I guess, the epiphany that I had at the time is it's like most people don't know where they've been exposed. So let's create a service to help them figure it out.
All right. So how do you get this information? Well, first of all, what is a data breach? Just let's cover that. What does it mean for your data to be breached? And then how do you come across that information?
So the strict definition is where there's been data exposed to unauthorized parties. So typically within Have I Been Pwned, data breaches are someone has found either a vulnerability in a system, so there's been some bad coding that's given them access to the database. Many times it's a misconfiguration as well. So there's a database out there and it doesn't have a password on it. Even just this morning, I was looking at one where someone has published all of their data to a publicly facing website and it's just in a directory listing. So it's literally like, here is a list of all the data, go for it. It can also be cases where someone accesses data and redistributes it in an unauthorized fashion. So we had a bit of news here a couple of days ago where someone working for a major financial institution had just started copying data and had taken it home with them and was inevitably going to use it for nefarious purposes. So that's not necessarily a vulnerability in a system, that's just someone abusing their position of power.
And this data is taken by the hackers or whoever it's taken by, and it's put where, and how do you get a hold of it?
So it goes to a variety of different places, and it really sort of depends. In some cases, it's taken by hackers and then it's kept very private. Now, what do they do with it when it's private? Well, they could do anything from use that information to try and access people's accounts. So they might log into the account and gain access to anything from financial records to personal messaging. They might use that data on other accounts because people do tend to reuse their passwords. So they'll say, hey, look, I've just got, let's say it's your LinkedIn email address and password. I'm now going to go and log into your eBay because you use the same password. And once they're in the eBay, maybe they'll go and purchase goods under this person's identity and then ship those to a location where they can then convert them into cash. So there's certainly the sort of the private socialization of this data. One of the things that I never really understood the extent of before I started this project is how much data is just socialized and traded between individuals. And what I mean by that is that there are people sitting on literally thousands of different individual data breaches that just share them with their mates. It's like, hey, I've got, let's say the Plex data breach. I was in the Plex data breach because I used the Plex media service and their forum had a data breach, and someone will say, I've got that. Would you like it? Yeah, what can you give me? And they exchange it. A little bit like they might exchange baseball cards or something, but unlike baseball cards, it's digital. So it doesn't it's not a constant state of numbers. It replicates over and over and over again.
And this is on like the dark web, or and if so, what? Explain to me what the dark web is, and do they charge for this data? Do you have to pay for this data when you get it for your site? So
the dark web, first of all, is something that's not quite as scary as it sounds. In fact, I always have a lot of fun when people sort of say, oh, yeah, I've heard about the dark web. Sounds very scary. And I'll say, like, okay, let me show you what the dark web is. Now, in fact, just a couple of weeks ago, I was with a friend of mine and she said, look, I've never seen the dark web. This sounds kind of scary and mysterious. Can you show me? And I said, all right, here's what the dark web is. You download the Tor browser bundle for free off the normal internet. Now you're on the dark web, and it looks just like the clear web. And the only difference is your connection is routed through multiple hops, and both the client and the server are anonymous. So without some form of decloaking, which is another story altogether, you're effectively anonymous as you're browsing the internet, and the services which are running behind that are anonymous as well. Now, we often sort of hear the dark web being referred to in the context of things like underground drug markets. There's certainly a lot of drugs. Sites like the Silk Road were very infamous for that. And certainly digital goods are exchanged on these services too. You can go and buy data breaches. But equally, a huge amount of data is just sitting there on the clear web. And what I mean by that is that there are all sorts of everything from sort of forums to just collections of data in stashes and folders that are accessible via your normal browser. I've seen, particularly over the last couple of weeks, a huge amount of data being socialized via Twitter. This is not the dark web. This is one of the world's biggest social media platforms. Click the link. Here's 1 billion, 5 billion, 12 billion records of people's email addresses and passwords. And to your question about paying for it, there are certainly people that sell this data I've always taken the position that I think paying for this data, regardless of the potential illegalities of that, and I'm sure there are some depending on your jurisdiction, it is not the right thing to do because it incentivizes criminal activity.
Sure.
If I go and pay someone for a data breach and they go, hang on a moment, so if I come up with data, I can make money from it. And their moral compass is possibly aligned such that they'll go and try and find data in other places, and it just makes the whole thing worse.
Sure. Yeah. So, like these other folks, you're the nooks and crannies to look in, and you're kind of, surfing around and hanging around some of these same places that this data is trafficked, and you just download what you can for free, and that's what you make available on your site for searching for people to find out if they've been part of this data breach.
Yeah, and to be clear, these days, and in fact, to be honest, not too long after I started the project, there are so many people that popped up and said, look, we sort of support what you do. We think it's a good idea. Let us send you data. So it's very rare these days for me to actually go out looking for things, which is very convenient for me.
Oh, sure, yeah.
People will pop up and send it to me, and it's pretty much a daily basis. Someone says, look, here's some data, and it might be anything from 1,000 records through to recently over 1 billion records. And these people just pop up out of the woodwork. Sometimes it's the same suspects over and over again. Sometimes they're very mainstream white hat security researchers that want to be publicly recognised. Other times it is probably people that were very, very close to illegally taking the data in the first place. Maybe it was the person. I try not to ask too many questions, if I'm honest.
So we hear about them all the time now. They're on the news, and they don't qualify things too much in the news as far as usually what you hear is like the number, like how bad it is depends on how many records there were. But in your opinion, what are the real worst data breaches, and either historically or just qualitatively speaking, what are the really worst data breaches and that we've had? I guess let's start with historically. What were some of the worst ones and why? And does the news get it right when they report these things? Because it seems to me like they overhype a lot of things.
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. There are certainly media outlets out there, and in particular some journalists out there that specialise in this area, and they are just fantastic at objectively reporting, and they understand the technology and they understand the implications. But by the same token, there's a lot of media out there, particularly once it becomes consumer-facing, and it's journalists who may not specialise in the area. Things do tend to get misrepresented. But in terms of what makes a data breach a severe thing and what are some of the notable ones in the past, I guess there's different ways of looking at it. And certainly the most obvious one is the number of records. But the number of records alone can be a pretty poor metric. So recently, we're going back about a few weeks before recording, I loaded a data breach into Have I Been Pwned that had 733 million records, which was the single largest one I'd ever put in there. And this was a collection of email addresses and passwords from many different data breaches. Now, that was very noteworthy in terms of the volume because 750 million is rather a large number.
Yes.
But it's only email addresses and passwords, which, on the one hand, doesn't expose any, say, sensitive, personally identifiable information. On the other hand, this is stuff that will get you into other accounts. So that's quite serious. But then a lot of the data was old as well. And sort of the real world impact of that was notable but not severe. Now, at the other end of the scale, if we take something like Ashley Madison back in 2015, so this is the website designed for people to have an affair. In fact, their strapline was, life is short, have an affair.
Right, yeah.
And they had a data breach with over 30 million people in it. Now, that's a lot smaller than 733 million. But it is people who were out there explicitly looking for affairs. So obviously there's going to be social stigma and moral judgment and everything there. It had information that was personally sensitive, things like sexual orientation, fantasies, like things that are really, really deeply personal.
Yeah.
As well as things like payment card information as well. So it had payment records in there from people that actually bought access to the service. And the impact of that was everything from many, many different people losing jobs because they were now outed. There were lots of services that popped up and made the data publicly searchable. In fact, that was the first time I went, look, there are some classes of data that just should not be publicly searchable.
Yeah.
But there are many services out there that did that. There were people like literally posting to their community bulletin boards in paper, like stuck to a corkboard. Here's a list of the people in our community that were on this site.
Oh, wow.
So, some pretty serious shaming. And there are people that killed themselves. So in terms of impact, like that's about as severe as you can get. And I can't think of another incident that's come even close to that in terms of the real world impact on a broad number of people.
Yeah, very good point. Now, do we have any idea, do state actors get involved at this level, or do we know if they're either buying and or selling this information at the, probably our government or China or Russia or whoever, pick your boogeyman.
All the usual suspects, yeah. Well, look, I mean, what we do know, and particularly over the last probably 2.5 years, as you guys approach the 2016 election, the whole sort of premise of state hacking became a much more mainstream headline. And look, being very rational about it makes sense when you think about it, because you think about the number of connected systems that we have online, and think about the amount of critical infrastructure which is connected, and all of this runs on the internet. Like, this is the sort of stuff that state actors definitely want to get access to. Now, either they want to get access because they want to understand more about things like the way corporations are planning their products. We see a lot about corporate espionage lately. There certainly has been a lot of discussions between the US and China in particular about that. We also see a genuine interest in wanting to have control of critical infrastructure, and as a result, we see governments getting very cautious about things like using Chinese products in, say, 5G networks is one of the topics at the moment. So in many parts of the Western world, the likes of Huawei and ZTE are out as contenders for critical infrastructure, which of course then makes it very, very hard, because these are the guys that are actually producing some of the best hardware out there at really cost-effective prices too. So
right. Yeah.
That becomes very difficult. And then, of course, the whole election hacking thing, where we sort of went, well, it's kind of... It's hacking, but not in the obnoxious, we have all your data or control of your systems. This is now trying to manipulate public perception in really, really subtle ways sometimes.
Yeah.
And, I think that's sort of equal parts fascinating and scary.
Oh, yeah. So, in today's age, data brokers are now a thing. There are, I saw an estimate somewhere, there's 2,500 to 4,000 of these just in the U.S. alone. But do we know, are these data brokers companies' databases being hacked and stolen as well? And if so, how would we know? I mean, if Target or Equifax, somewhere I'm kind of a direct customer of, gets hacked, they will often notify me. These data brokers sure as heck aren't going to tell me, I had a whole bunch of stuff on you, and by the way, it just got hacked.
Well, the brokers is a really interesting one, because there's a whole spectrum of legitimacy there. And frankly, if I'm honest, I think the whole spectrum is a little bit shady in the same sort of common ways, insofar as they have a huge amount of our data without us necessarily knowing about it. And no, like burying it on page 50 of your terms and conditions is not us knowing about it.
Right.
But hey, we did say we read them all and we agreed to them before we signed up to that service. So we're seeing everything from, on the most shady side of things, services which aggregate huge amounts of data and sell them with a pretty explicit intent of disadvantaging the people that are in there. So, for example, the data being used for account takeover attempts because you're sharing the username and password, through to really mainstream stuff. I mean, we saw Dun & Bradstreet had a data breach a couple of years ago with a service called Net Prospects. And Net Prospects was just a whole bunch of data used for, if you look at the headlines on a lot of these sort of mainstream quasi above board services, it'll be like optimize your revenue pipeline and enhance economies of scale. Like it'll just be full of words from like marketing handbooks.
Oh yeah.
And what they're trying to do is create like really rich profiles of people that can be used for better targeting. And of course, the more personal information they have, the better other organizations can target you. Like if they understand what you like to eat for breakfast, they can target you in a way that they wouldn't be able to if they didn't know that information. And the thing that I really lament is just how many of these there are. I mean, I was in one the other day. My own personal address was in one from a company called Apollo. Now, Apollo.io apparently had my data. I had no idea why they had my data. And when I really started probing and drilling down into it, there was another service I use. I use a service called New Relic. I use it as part of the monitoring for Have I Been Pwned. And New Relic used Apollo as part of the service that they delivered to me, and they gave my data to Apollo. And I probably agreed to it in the terms and conditions, but now suddenly it's like, who are these Apollo guys, and why do they have my data? Along with the data of tens of millions of other people.
So let's ask the fundamental question. Why are these breaches happening in the first place? Why is it that these that so many companies cannot seem to protect our data? Is it that hard to do, or are they doing it wrong?
Look, I think it's a little bit of both to different degrees. There are certainly cases where we see, like I said earlier on, like coding flaws. So, for example, there are flaws like SQL injection flaws. We've had around for more than a decade, broadly considered the number one web application security risk in the world. And we see it being exploited over and over and over again. We still have not fixed this problem. Through to misconfigurations, like literally you have no password on your database and it's facing the world. But for that sort of thing to happen, you normally have to have a series of events go wrong. I mean, you have to not put a password on your database. That's one thing. But secondly, databases like that really shouldn't be sitting there just facing the world. They should be firewalled off and in a private network somewhere. So those sort of things continue to go wrong. But I guess the bit of sympathy that I have for these organizations as well is that we have so many moving parts in software now. There are so many different services and so many people responsible for managing them. It requires sort of a really mature organization in many ways to get these things right. And that doesn't necessarily mean a big organisation with a lot of money, because we see, Equifax, for example, have a major data breach. And the Equifax data breach only happened because a whole series of different things went wrong and the planets aligned and the rest is history.
So is another reason for this, though, and I keep coming back to this, and is that there are really no repercussions for screwing it up. I mean, look at Equifax. They had a huge, massive data breach of really awesome information for identity thieves. Nothing happened. And not only that, but I'm not their customer. I didn't choose Equifax. There's nothing, I couldn't take my business elsewhere. Isn't that part of the problem, is that they're not incentivized to get it right?
I think it depends on how you look at it, and you can kind of argue it both ways. You can certainly make that argument that there's just not enough disincentive and nothing really bad happened. On the other hand, the CEO lost his job. The CISO lost her job as well. Some people, I believe, are going to jail for insider trading, or certainly facing criminal charges. I mean, the insider trading thing's a little bit parallel.
That's parallel, right? That's
just a mess.
That
there are certainly severe ramifications for executives, but I suspect the court of public opinion would sort of say, CEO lost their job, probably walked out with $100 million or whatever it is as well. Like, maybe that's not like sufficient punishment. So I could sort of understand that. It's interesting to sort of look at the way regulations differ around the world as well.
Mm-hmm.
In Europe, last year got some fairly severe regulations in their General Data Protection Regulation,
right,
or GDPR, where an organisation now can be fined up to 4% of their gross annual worldwide turnover. And suddenly it's like, well, actually, that's a lot of money, because previously the fines have often just been, they've just been ridiculous. And I'll give you a good example. There's a company in the UK called TalkTalk. They're a large telco, and they had a big data breach in 2015, and it was a massive news story. Turned out to be perpetrated literally by children. So there's a 17-year-old. In fact, there's a photo of a 17-year-old walking out of court. You can't see his face because he's literally a child. So, you get a child able to do this amount of damage. And their Information Commissioner's Office over there leveled the largest ever fine handed out to a UK company at them, which was £400,000. Now, this is a company with revenue of $1.8 billion a year, and you get a £400,000 fine. And to put that in context, if you earn $100,000 a year, this is like getting a $20 fine. Like it's lunch.
Yeah.
Now, if you get fined your lunch, are you going to do it again? Well, it's not a lot of disincentive. But then the other metric there is TalkTalk says it cost them £42 million, the incident in its entirety. Everything from identity theft protection for people and the security companies had to come in and clean up the mess. I don't know if that includes sort of reputation damage and other losses and things like that. But certainly it's a lot more than just the regulatory cost itself. But I think we all feel that a $20 fine for someone earning $100,000 a year is not really that, it doesn't really have teeth.
Right, for sure. I think thankfully, at least some of the GDPR, even though I don't know how likely it is we'll have something like that here in the US, and I don't know, do you have anything similar to GDPR in Australia, either looming or recently passed?
So last year, we finally got our mandatory data breach disclosure laws, which is called the Notifiable Data Breach Scheme in Australia. And it's It's better than not having one, but it's really, really weak. And there's sort of three things that just continue to stick out to me and many others in there. And one of them is that it's only a notifiable data breach if we're talking about an organisation that has turnover of more than 3 million Australian dollars a year. Now, that is less than 10% of Aussie businesses. It's also only a notifiable data breach if the organisation believes it's likely to cause serious harm to the subject matter. And there are a number of different tests for this, but none of those tests include things like you've lost usernames and passwords and people have reused them everywhere else. So, you might be running like a cat forum or something like that, which is fine. And you go, it's usernames and passwords. It's not going to cause serious harm. Well, no, it is, because that's the username and password for your bank account and for your eBay and everything else.
Right.
And then the third thing that's a bit wacky with this one is that whereas in the case of like GDPR, you've got 72 hours to report a breach to the local regulator, Australia's gone, like people are busy, they're down the beach, they've got things to do. Here, we'll give them a month. I lament the fact that I can sort of be sitting there with my European mates and they get all of these protections under EU law and I don't get them under Aussie law. But, look, we have something now. It's a starting point. Hopefully we'll get more alignment with Europe in the future.
Yeah, and some of that stuff is actually spilling out because these are global companies, and a lot of them are just making the decision, if I'm going to have to do this for Europe, I may as well do it everywhere. So in some cases, we're getting a little bit of rub off from that, a little bit of benefit from that. But I know that in the U.S. we have trouble with that too, because the way the courts are kind of set up and the way these class action lawsuits are set up, you have to kind of be able to prove that you've been harmed. And a lot of times, by the time you've been harmed, it's too late. And then a lot of times there's no way to tell that the reason my identity, was stolen was because of the Equifax breach. So that being able to prove standing is something that defeats a lot of these class action lawsuits, and therefore, yet another reason why there's no repercussions.
So, this is another one of those sort of double-edged swords thing, and I often have lawyers get in touch with me after a data breach. Yeah, sometimes literally within 24 hours of a data breach, and say, we're doing a class action lawsuit. And I'm sorry, but if lawyers start contacting you within 24 hours, this is not like, hey, we've suddenly had like a rush of people really worried about their personal safety. It's, as far as I'm concerned, it becomes a real money grab.
Sure.
And, you make a good point in terms of demonstrating harm, but I'll give you a good example of where this just gets exploited. There was a data breach of a Hong Kong toy maker called VTech. This is probably about 4 years ago or something now.
I remember that.
And VTech lost millions of... Well, actually, let's not use the word lost. Someone broke in through a vulnerability in VTech systems, which should never have been there, took out millions of records about parents' contact information, also children's names, photos, birth dates, and references back to the parents with their physical address. So like really, really bad stuff. So one person took it out, gave it to a very reputable journalist. That reputable journalist gave it to me to analyse, and there were 3 of us in the world that had this data. And in the wash-up of that, I end up having chats with everyone from VTech lawyers through to law enforcement, all very, very positive chats too, mind you. And it ended up that we said, look, let's just try and delete every single trace of this we have. And I certainly did that on my side. They arrested someone in the UK, and I'm sure the journalist did the right thing too. So now you've had this incident, which shouldn't have been there, but there is no data circulating around, and people are trying to mount class action lawsuits. And to your point about the damage, I'm 99% sure that there was no damage to anyone. So why are you mounting a lawsuit?
Interesting.
Don't get me wrong. I want the regulator to throw the book at them over this, because this was crazy, particularly when kids are involved.
Yeah.
But you can't be suing for damages when there are no damages. And as I understand it, I think those class action lawsuits actually failed, which is a good thing. But you can sort of see how it muddies the water as well, where we've got people saying, look, I want to sue for damages, or by the way, I don't have any damages.
Yeah, that's a great counterpoint. I'd never heard that story. That from that angle, anyway. That's really interesting. Is there a way for the average consumer, certainly the non-technical consumer, to compare the relative security of these services and companies that might want to give data to? So if I'm wanting the invisible hand of the market to work, and I'm the informed consumer, is there really anything I can do to pick a company or not pick a company because I think they may or may not be more likely to lose my data in a data breach? My point, I think, is that there is no way, but I'd like to hear your opinion.
No. There's no way. Honestly, that's how simple the answer is. It's funny, actually. So I often have people say to me, oh, you run this Have I Been Pwned site. Why should I trust you with my data? And I say, all right, first of all, it's an email address. The only way email addresses even work is you give them to other people. Unless you do that, you can't actually do anything with an email address. Also, when you go to Have I Been Pwned, you'll see how all of these big companies that you trusted with it have actually lost the data. I mentioned LinkedIn and Dropbox and all these sorts of organizations. And the reality of it is that you, me as well for that matter, have absolutely no way of assessing how likely an organization is to lose your data when you give it to them. So you have to sort of take this defensive position of making the assumption that sooner or later everyone's going to screw it up somehow. So what does that mean in terms of your behavior? Well, okay, with passwords, I use a password manager and I make them strong and unique and I don't reuse them, and I use two-factor authentication. With the other data I provide people, I only give data that I absolutely positively need to give them. I don't want to give you my birth date for some random forum, because a birth date is a piece of identity verification information. I don't particularly want to give you my home address if I don't need to. And frankly, I even lament sort of handing over my passport when I walk into a hotel somewhere. It's like, why do you want my passport? Because, hey, Marriott and Starwood just happened, and they lost a whole bunch of this data. And, unfortunately, we're sort of in this phase where organizations look at personal data as an asset. They want to collect as much of it as possible because it's valuable to them.
Yes.
And they never look at it as a liability, but it is both.
Yeah, that is a very good point. And that's, yes, that is something that I've talked about several times as well. And it's part of a lot of the GDPR and some of the laws that are being thrown around here in the U.S. is the minimization, and Apple, Tim Cook of Apple called this out recently as well, and the minimization of data collection, and it's getting away from that notion of collecting as much as possible because it might be useful someday, and seeing it as a liability and just kind of as a responsibility for these companies toward their customers to not collect anything that need to know. Only tell me what I need to know and no more. But obviously we've got a ways to go before we get to that point.
Well, I mean, Apple's a really interesting example here where for several years now, they've sort of been carving out their reputation as a privacy-centric company. And they've been in the news the last few days because they're going to start really cracking down on applications that are doing extensive tracking of the way you interact with applications, which I think is a positive thing. Of course, the counter-argument here from many organizations is that those usage patterns and the user profiling and the personal data, they do treat as an asset. It has value. They sell that. They monetize it.
Right.
So it's going to sort of be interesting to see how things unfold over time. And there are very powerful organizations on the one hand that want to have all that data, and then there's very sort of privacy-centric initiatives on the other side.
Well, and I think it's important, and I'm glad you brought it up. It's so important to realize that this is a two-sided coin, this double-edged sword. There are, if let's say in an ideal utopian society where this data could be protected and it isn't, bandied about and sold without your knowledge, and et cetera, there are some really amazing things that we could do by collecting all this data. I mean, it's just having all this data would allow us to do some really positive things for society, for individuals. Sometimes I give the example of Her, the movie Her. I don't know if you've seen that with Joaquin Phoenix, but he's got this little earpiece, but he's got this AI that he kind of falls in love with eventually. I don't want to give too many spoilers, but he's trusted this AI with everything. I mean, this thing knows everything about it. But I mean, if in the ideal scenario where that person is on his side, this AI, they're not giving it away. That person can now help him with all sorts of things because she knows everything about him. But of course, the flip side of that is if you collect that and you can't keep hold of it, then you got problems.
Yeah, and this is, I sort of can't see us going in any direction other than having more data than ever before. Even if you just think about everything sort of personal fitness trackers through to the fact that your TV is connected and everyone's got a home assistant, like we're going to have more data than ever before. And there are some good reasons for it too. I mean, I certainly love my connected techie things. I think they're fantastic. But we've really got to sort of be thinking about the longer term ramifications.
Yeah.
On the other hand as well, the generational, tolerance for personal data and sharing is changing too. And I got onto the internet in sort of the mid-90s, just as I reached adulthood, and I have enough recollection of a time where we weren't sharing everything. But there are, I think about my kids, like they're going to have a really different tolerance to the amount of information they share because they've just never known a different time. So maybe what's going to happen over time is that the older guard will sort of, let's face it, die, and then the newer ones will come in, and they've just got a really different sensitivity, and it's just going to change the landscape of how we treat data privacy.
Yeah, I wonder about that too. I've got two daughters, and I try to tell them, anything you put out there is going to be there forever, so be careful. All right, so let's wrap things up a little with some practical matters. So let's talk about how to use your site. So let's say, I'm worried that there's been another data breach, and whether or not I've been, contacted by that, that company saying I'm affected. I'm still worried that I might be, or maybe I'm just generally worried. And I want to go. I've learned about your site, haveibeenpwned.com, and I go there. What now? What? How do I use your site effectively?
So there's really sort of two parts to it. So one is that the front page of Have I Been Pwned has an email address field. You put in an email address, comes back, it tells you where it's been exposed. Maybe it's nowhere. Maybe it's like my old address and it's been in like 15 different places. There's also a feature there where you can say, look, let me know if it appears somewhere else in the future in a subsequent data breach. And that just sends you a verification email. You click the link, it's good to go. And of course, it's all free as well. It's a community-centric thing. So there's that piece. There's also a password piece, and I kind of lamented this a little bit because it ultimately boils down to checking if a password has been exposed somewhere. But one of the interesting initiatives that's sort of happening in the industry is we're moving more towards recognizing that data breaches are a thing. They expose passwords. Let us try and maybe not use those passwords anymore once they've been exposed, like regardless of how good they were. Maybe it's like all of your dogs and children's names together. If it's been exposed, that's probably not something you want to use. So there's a password search feature, and it has an anonymity model behind it, so your password never actually gets sent to the service, but it allows you to see if it's been exposed somewhere. And the kind of cool thing about that is a lot of organizations are now building this into their registration flow and into their login flow, where they take the passwords people are providing to the site, they anonymize it, they send it to Have I Been Pwned. And there's about 7 or 8 million requests a day from various organizations today just to check whether it's appeared somewhere before. And then what these services are doing is they're hitting that service and they're coming back and they're saying, hey, anything from, just so you know, this password has appeared in a breach before, maybe you don't want to use it, through to, in some cases, just saying, no, like this password's been seen 50,000 times before. You should not be using this.
Well, and I published this list, in various locations in my book and other places. They're now famous for, at least people in our industry, the famous, 100 worst passwords every year. And of course, what those passwords are, it's the passwords that have been leaked. Otherwise, we wouldn't know of them. But password is still like the number one, PASSWRD is like still the number one password, or the number 2 every year, along with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I would think that at the very least, that list would be a place to start to tell people, the automated services, when I'm trying to set a password, they're like, no, you can't use that one because everybody uses that one. Do you see that starting to happen as well? Are they starting to use that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And this is what they're using the Have I Been Pwned data for. There's 550 million passwords in this repository from previous locations. And one of the things that I'm really trying to drive in the industry, and I guess just to sort of take a step back for a moment, I think the solution to a lot of these issues is that there's a shared responsibility between both individuals and organizations to do security better. So individuals have the freedom to choose pretty much whatever password they want and whether they reuse it and whether they turn on two-factor. Organizations are in a position of responsibility where they can help sort of lead people down the path of success. And one of the things I'm really trying to get organizations away from is this traditional mathematical view of password strength. Yeah. And what I mean by that is that the mathematical view is if you have more character types and if you have more length, then the password is better because the entropy increases. So what ends up happening is someone says, well, okay, I want to meet the minimum password criteria. So I'm going to use the word password as a password, but I'm going to capitalize the P. I'm going to put an @ symbol instead of the A, and I'm going to change the O to a 0, and it's 8 characters long. So now I have uppercase, lowercase, non-alphanumeric, 8 characters, job done. And you look at it and you go, but this is a terrible password. Well, yes, it's a terrible password, but only because our human brains can recognize the pattern within it. So this is where I sort of got to get away from the mathematical side. And there are still loads of websites out there where you could go and generate a pass phrase. So this is like 4 totally random dictionary words in a totally random order. you think about the number of different possibilities there are with that. But you can't use that password because you didn't have an uppercase character.
Right.
In some cases, you can't use that password because it has a space. So it's really trying to get away from this very archaic way of thinking and take a much more sort of pragmatic, evidence-based way to how we help people create good passwords.
So that actually leads me to a question. I'm glad you said that because it tripped this, and I've always wanted to know this question. I'm wondering if you know the answer. When you enter passwords, if it's done correctly, the passwords aren't stored as passwords. They're hashed and stored, which, it's this mathematical kind of munging that we were kind of alluding to earlier, where it's not, if they're doing it correctly, they're not storing the actual password. And yet some of these sites still say you can't use that character. What do they care? If it's hashed, why does that even matter?
Well, it's a very good question. And there's probably sort of two traditional problems with the way password restrictions were put in place. So one of the traditional problems was if the password was going to be redisplayed to an operator, there'd be restrictions. Now, a good example here is that you'll see websites say, well, you can't use angle brackets. So, well, hang on a second. So angle brackets are what we use for HTML, which is what's behind every web page. So are you going to be putting that on a web page? And that's your I guess, criteria for blocking it. And then by the same token, there are many websites out there that say, we have a list of naughty words. You cannot use a naughty word. And you're looking at it going, well, like what? Is the website going to get offended? No, there's an operator somewhere that's going to read that later on and they don't want to see an offensive word. So, we've got that side of things where passwords are obviously being redisplayed, and that's why the restrictions are there. And then we've got things like there are characters such as, say, apostrophes. We don't want you to use apostrophes, or sometimes we don't even want you to use the word select, which is used in database queries because people are worried about attacks against the database. Now, you're totally right. Where in both these cases, if that is the rationale and that's the basis for blocking those characters, well, then the passwords are not being cryptographically hashed and stored correctly. Now, I suspect in some cases they actually are, but then there's legacy things that have carried that forward. But, we sort of have this like thin veneer of the security posture of an organization, which is what we view in the browser. And when this is what you see, then people do draw conclusions that don't look real good for the organization.
Yeah. Okay, so how comprehensive and up-to-date is the information you have? And I'll bring up a specific example. You alluded to you mentioned the 733 million passwords that came through recently. And that's part of what they were calling Collection 1. And then there were collections 2 through 5 that were dumped shortly after that, which is, I think, almost 3 times as big. And I noticed, I just checked your website earlier today before we got on, and it doesn't list that yet. Are you basically at this point at the mercy of someone delivering that to you, and that's why it's not there, or does it just take a long time for it to process? And in general speaking, how up to date is your database with the breaches?
I have the data, and it's not about 3 times the size; it's about 10 times the size.
Wow!
It's ginormous. Altogether, the data is around about a terabyte, and Collection 1 was, I think, about 83 gigabytes. So, to be honest, I'm sort of lamenting the rationale of just continually loading mass volumes of collated lists. And there's a few reasons for this. So I loaded this Collection 1 data 3 weeks ago. In fact, I loaded it on a Thursday 3 weeks ago in the morning my time. And now the morning my time is when everyone else around the world's going to bed. So I had a peaceful day. And then I got on a plane to fly to Europe that afternoon. And it's just like the gates of hell opened on my email account. And I spent the flight from Brisbane to Dubai and then Dubai through to Oslo just battling emails. And I literally got thousands of emails and hundreds of blog comments, thousands of tweets. It just got absolutely inundated. And there are a whole range of different responses to this. And unfortunately, it was made even worse by the media picking it up and just fundamentally misrepresenting things. Now, mind you, I wrote like a 3,500 word blog post. I was not going to leave any stone unturned. Like every detail was in there. But still, things got very misrepresented. And then, of course, people popped up and said, hey, did you know there's these other collections? So I've grabbed those and I've been analysing them. And I do have a draft blog post about what I intend to do with them. But I guess the bit that I'm lamenting here is that where does it end? Because there's the other collections, but there's also another list someone sent me that had another 13 billion records in them.
Oh, my goodness.
Now, And what happens tomorrow if someone takes those two lists and they combine them together and there's a 20 billion, like where does it end? It's one thing to say this discrete, clearly identifiable organization had a data breach and this is their data and we can verify it. It's another thing to say, look, there's just a great big collated list floating around.
So you mentioned that you could subscribe to your service, and you could, if you go and search for your email address and don't find it, you might breathe a sigh of relief. But if you'd like to be notified, you can do that. So would you recommend that if people are concerned about this, that I must have 12 email addresses personally. Maybe most people don't have that many, but would you just go and register every email address you're worried about, and would that be a good preventative thing? Would you recommend people do that?
Yeah, sure. And maybe preventative is not the right word because it doesn't stop it from happening.
Sure,
but
yeah.
it's knowledge, right? And it's awareness. And I think for the most part, people want to know what's being done with their data. And that was sort of a large part of the reason why I loaded the Collection 1 data. It's like, well, did you know that your data is being circulated as part of a list and they're trying to break into your account using a previously used password? So I think that's good, useful information for people. Now, of course, if they do then learn about an incident, they've got to decide what to do. And frankly, if they're using strong, unique passwords, in 90% plus of cases, that solves the problem. If you're on Ashley Madison, it doesn't solve that problem. That's a different problem. But yeah, that's a good start, and it's awareness, right?
So you also have this option for opting out. Explain what that is and why someone might want to do that.
Yeah, so the premise of opting out is that you may not want to be publicly searchable. And there's a whole debate here about, look, should it be opt-out by default or not? And there are some really fundamental technical reasons why I can't do that. And I have written about it. There's actually a blog post called The Ethics of Running a Data Breach Service, which explains why. But what the opt-out does is it lets you say, look, I want to remove myself from public visibility so that other people can no longer find me. I do still store the email address because I want to make sure that if there's a subsequent data breach, then you're not inadvertently opted back in. But it does remove you from that public visibility, but it still allows you, if you control the email address, to come back and see where you've been exposed.
So, devil's advocate, if I'm a hacker, can I use your site for my benefit in any way?
Well, you would be able to use it to see where people have been exposed. So, for example, you could put my email address in and see that I've got a LinkedIn account and a Dropbox account and these sorts of things. And, that's always going to be a risk, right? Because that is a disclosure. If we put it in context, there are sort of other reasons why that's maybe not as bad as it sounds on the surface. And one of the reasons is if you're a hacker genuinely interested in doing this stuff, a lot of these data breaches are really easily accessible anyway. So you could go and pull down, for example, we just mentioned these collections. They're literally being shared on Twitter. Go and do a Twitter search, you'll find it very, very quickly, and you'll pull down billions and billions of records anyway. There's also enumeration vectors in pretty much all these services. If you really want to know whether someone has an account on Ashley Madison, you can't find out on Have I Been Pwned, but you can find out on Ashley Madison because a lot of these services disclose the presence of an account through, if not password reset, then registration or other vectors such as timing attacks against the login facility. So a lot of the time this information is discoverable anyway. And now that's not to say that I'm not conscious of the fact that this is sort of one consolidated vector by which this can be discovered. But on balance, and a lot of this is detailed in that blog post as well, the ability to make this information discoverable publicly is also really valuable. And I mean, just one example of many here is that there are a lot of online organizations that use this as part of their support process where someone says, look, let's say they have a Spotify account. Hey, Spotify, someone's just taken over my account. You guys have been hacked. And Spotify can sort of look at that email address and go, well, hey, just so you know, like you've actually been in these other data breaches. Is there any chance that you've reused your password? So it kind of helps people join the dots as well.
Oh, sure. You earlier ticked off the, if we were going to recommend to people what they do to protect themselves proactively for things. And you mentioned using a password manager so that you can have unique, long, strong, crazy, random passwords that you don't have to remember for each site. And two-factor authentication, which means there's got, the second step and defense in depth that keeps people out of those things. First of all, is there anything else? And second of all, are there any particular password managers you can recommend?
So, maybe to start with the last question first, I use a password manager called 1Password, which is made by a company called HIBP, and I've used them for, I think, about 8 years now. And I chose them because they worked across all my devices. I have iPhone, iPad, and PCs, and everything sort of syncs nicely. I use the family sharing facility there so that I can exchange things with my wife and and now my kids as they start getting a little bit older. So I'm very, very happy with that product. And then in addition to that, I obviously turn on two-factor authentication, as discussed earlier on. I have a Google account as well, and they've got this advanced protection program that uses universal two-factor keys, which is a really, really slick implementation. Like if you want to lock down your Gmail, absolutely beautiful setup. It can't be phished like other mechanisms of 2FA, things like authenticator tokens, which are great in terms of cost effectiveness, can still be phished. U2F keys can't, so that they're a really positive thing. And, like I said earlier on, just being conscious of what I share. Like I'm just not going to share information that I don't positively have to anymore.
Yeah, I've often told people, like one of the classes I teach, that there's no reason you can't lie. In a lot of cases where they're asking for their information, I mean, for your date, what they usually want to know is if you're a minor or not. In a lot of cases, so just give them a birth date that makes you not a minor. If they're asking other things like, and even on the questions, like the security questions, which hopefully we'll get away from, but there's still a lot of sites that, have you answer 3 questions. You don't have to give them the truth. Yeah. You could give them a lie as long as you remember what that lie is. And you put that, like, say, in your password manager so that when they ask them again, you can know what your lie was. That's always something I talk about too. So you actually have, and I'm sure that's no coincidence since you like 1Password, you've actually integrated with 1Password and they're actually using your service. Is there anybody else using your service? Or are you looking for any other integrations? I know Google Chrome is starting to do this too, but I don't think it's in with you. I think it's just their own thing.
So Google Chrome has just done their password checker. This launched a couple of days before recording. And, I've had some chats with them and they gave me a heads up on it. And I think that what they're doing is really good insofar as this is more awareness for people. And Google obviously has rather a sizable audience. So if they can do this and sort of bring this knowledge to the forefront, that's awesome. Mozilla has integrated Have I Been Pwned with their Firefox Monitor service. So you can go to monitor.firefox.com and all of that sits on top of Have I Been Pwned. So, again, it's Firefox. Like they've got massive audience, a massive audience. And that's great because it can bring the data to the masses more. And then because there's an API ecosystem, I don't even know how many different organizations out there that have integrated it into, everything from identity theft protection products through to password managers. And, that's great. Like I want to see the data used as broadly as possible to make positive changes.
Well, it's so great that what you're doing, and it's been such a huge help for everybody. And I hope that the audience goes and checks this out and spreads the word, because it's one of those tools that could really be helpful, maybe to give you peace of mind to know that maybe you weren't part of a breach, or to give you the heads up that, maybe you should do something, especially if you're the kind of person like most of us are that reuse passwords. Maybe this will finally, push you to go out there and get a password manager and start using unique passwords. So thank you so much for doing what you do. And thank you again for coming on the show. This has been really, really entertaining and very enlightening. Thanks, Troy.
My pleasure.
So yeah, I would say that interview held up very well. There's a lot of still really good advice in there, and the stories are still very interesting and relevant today. A lot of these data breaches today are happening in the same ways, sadly. But I always liked Troy's nuanced perspectives on things, like on how we talked about regulations and liability and how there's good and bad and in both of those, and how we have to be careful not to overdo it and have the pendulum swing too far the other way. And his just kind of no-nonsense approach in general. I ended up interviewing him 2 more times over the next couple of years, and it's frankly been too long. I would love to get Troy back on the show again sometime in the near future. So I will see if I can make that happen in 2026. But I have a link to his site in the show notes. You should definitely try that out. Try entering your email address or addresses, and maybe ones that you had used in the past, and you can see which breaches they were included in. And if you want to be notified, you can check the box saying, hey, if in the future you find me showing up at a breach, let me know. I've actually used the site many times, but I haven't really registered my email addresses, but I'm actually I'd forgotten you could do that. So I'm actually going to go back and do that on some of my most used email addresses from past years. I have tons of email addresses now, so I can't really put them all in, and some of them I honestly don't care about. But there are some that I definitely would like to know if they are suddenly involved in a breach. Now, I, of course, use a password manager, so all my passwords are long and strong and unique, crazy random passwords that there's no way that even if the bad guys got a hold of the password databases where all the passwords were hashed, it would take until the heat death of the universe before they could try to crack them. So it's not, I don't care if I'm part of a breach. But if you're at all worried and you use a password manager, it's actually also pretty easy just to go back and change your passwords on these sites as well. You don't have to remember them. You just click a button to generate them, and that's that. So if you're at all worried about it, it's also pretty easy to put your mind at ease. So if you're curious at all about the math on this, like if you challenge my notion that it would take all the supercomputers on the planet till the heat death of the universe to crack some of these passwords that I've created with my password manager, the math is actually pretty solid on this. So if you're curious, I have a couple articles you might want to check out. One called Password Haystacks and another one on strong pin codes that goes through some of the math at a very high level, but it will give you some numbers that should just blow your mind. So if you're at all curious, there's links in the show notes to those as well. Okay, so I'd said that NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the United States, has finally updated its password guidelines. This is in the form of their publication SP 800-63. Proton had a little blog about the major changes of password guidelines, and so I'm going to read from this blog article to give you an idea what they changed. First, use longer passwords. The NIST recommends a minimum password length of 8 characters and a maximum of 64. Longer passwords are harder to hack as they tend to be more unique than short but complex passwords that often follow a predictable pattern. Let me expand on that in a minute. The 8-character limit was only if you use two-factor authentication. If you don't have two-factor authentication, their minimum password length was 15 characters. And again, if you're generating these with a password manager, it doesn't really matter, right? I mean, I set mine to 20 as a minimum, and the only reason I don't go higher than that is there are some sites that just don't handle passwords longer than that. And 20 is plenty. Again, check out the articles I wrote on this. 20 is plenty. All right, number 2, the second change was to drop the complexity requirements. Building on the above guidelines, special character requirements result in complex passwords that, unfortunately, lead to predictable patterns that hackers can easily guess. Instead, accept all types of characters, including spaces, and encourage employees to come up with unique and memorable phrases, also known as passphrases, for their passwords. And unfortunately, I have to caveat this one too. Passphrases are great, and I've got an article about passphrases as well. Put that in the show notes. You should check it out. That's where you put together a string of random words, which we talked about in the interview with Troy. But what they're saying here is that using special characters is bad as a requirement if you are using passwords that you can remember. Because what happens, just like Troy said, is what people do is that they use characters in a way that's entirely predictable and not really making your password stronger. If you are randomly sprinkling in special characters into your password, like when you use a password manager, you say, yes, use special characters in my password, that does contribute to making your password harder to crack. So this article's kind of strange the way they wrote it, but anyway, that's why I'm here to give you my comments. Okay, the third thing, no more forced password resets. The only time a forced password reset should be enforced is when there is evidence of a compromise. Otherwise, forcing employees to reset their passwords every few months is considered bad practice, as the NIST has found that it actually makes password security weaker. And again, the reason it makes it weaker is because of human nature. If you're using passwords that you can remember, what people end up doing is they say, their password is my cool password. And their company says, well, you got to change that every 3 months. So at the end of 3 months, they change it to my cool password 1. And at the next 3 months, it's my cool password 2. So again, what's underlying a lot of these recommendations is because the way most people create passwords in ways they can remember, these sorts of rules don't make sense. Now, the one thing about working at a company that might require you to change your password every so often is if you're the kind of employee that might share passwords with someone else. Maybe it's access to a database where for some reason they're using a shared account and not everybody has their own account. That's dumb. You shouldn't do that. But if there's any kind of a situation where other employees might know one of the passwords or share a password, then it does make sense as people come and go, as people leave the company, that you do rotate those passwords from time to time. So personal stuff versus corporate stuff, there can be a difference there. All right, number 4, maintain a password block list. The NIST recommends that businesses maintain a password block list to prevent the use of easily exploited passwords such as 1234 or passwords that feature variations of the employee's or business's name. Additionally, it recommends using password checking services to ensure that employees don't use compromised passwords that have been exposed in breaches. Totally agree. Troy talked about this as well. There's no excuse for allowing anybody to set a password that is part of the 100,000 most common breached passwords. That's an easy check to make. It's a quick check to make. You can also look for A lot of simple things like this talks about here, the name of the company or the name of the person, things that you could easily check. There's just no excuse, honestly, not to check for just really poor passwords. All right, number 5, eliminate security questions and hints. Knowledge-based recovery hints and questions, such as what is your first pet, are an outdated practice. These answers are easily obtainable through social media. Instead, rely on secure recovery methods such as recovery links and verification codes during resets. Again, Troy talked about this. He said that 7 years ago when I interviewed him. And like what I said to him is if you still find sites that have this, you could just lie on those questions, or you could come up with ways to alter the answers in ways that you know, but someone else wouldn't know. Like, what was the name of your first pet? Well, if it's Fido, maybe your answer is not Fido. And it's what is your mother's maiden name? If it's Smith, you could say not Smith. So you could always, you've got a pattern there for how you answer those questions that you can remember, or you can just lie about those answers. It doesn't matter what they are. You just have to be able to reproduce your lie if they ever ask you to recover your account later. And I would suggest you don't do something that someone else would know. But hopefully we could just get rid of knowledge-based questions to reset your password anyway. Because at the end of the day, that is the weakest link. If I can reset your password, get into your email account, let's say, and get the password reset link, if I can go to a website where I know you have an account and say, hey, I forgot my password, ask you the 3 questions that only I should know the answer to, but you've figured out answers to, then they can recover your account and change the password. That is way weaker than a 20-character randomly generated password by a password manager. So it always comes back to what the weakest link is, and that's often the recovery mechanisms. Okay, and then finally 6, use modern security tools. Limiting the number of failed login attempts, requiring the use of multi-factor authentication, and utilizing tools such as an enterprise password manager provide crucial protection against modern cyber threats and help detect compromise. And I would add one more to that list, and that is have blocking based on the origin of the login attempt. If you're running a little mom and pop company with 10 employees in the middle of Indiana, you are pretty sure that anybody trying to log in from Russia should not be allowed. Okay, so there's links in the show notes for that stuff as well. Check it out. But it's been a welcome update and a long time coming. And honestly, NIST, one of the organizations that we rely on to come up with good guidelines, is behind the times here, and it's just finally catching up. All right, that's going to do it for this week. Hope you enjoyed that blast from the past. Patrons will get a bonus podcast on Thursday. And what I usually do opposite the classic replay episode, instead of having bonus Q&A, which is something I didn't do way back in the day, didn't have a bonus podcast back then. So what I'm going to do for this Thursday's bonus podcast is I'm going to do my annual State of the Realm address. Going to tell you how things have been going, where things are going to be going in the next year, that sort of thing. So that's going to do it for this week. Next week, we've got another best of episode, except this time it's going to be the best of all the bonus podcast material. So this is all the stuff that my patrons have access to. I went back over the last year and pulled out snippets from the bonus Q&A from some of my favorite interviews and stitched together a smorgasbord of the best content from those bonus podcasts. So if you're not a patron, you'll get a little taste of what my patrons get every week. So until then, everybody, stay safe out there. Again, happy holidays. And until next week, as always, don't get caught with your drawbridge down.